Well, still good morning here. I'm really at it. It's about 11:40 here. The sunshine is really hitting the car heavily. I'm having my first sweat this year, and we are counting the 22nd of March. So I finally got my hands on this most marvelous book. It is amazing. The Matter with Things by Ian McGilchrist. And I just had one day to look at it. I got it yesterday first. Well, Friday it was, to be completely honest. It goes beyond my exaggerated expectations. I would say this, what it says on the back of the cover, by Charles Foster, the well-renowned professor from Oxford. It's very simple. This is one of the most important books ever published. And yes, I do mean ever. Well, let's just start with the weight of it, and then I mean research weight. The index for all research, all facts gotten together, it is more than 100 pages. This could well be the largest collection of information regarding neurology, science of cognition, philosophy, science in general, biology, psychology, psychiatry, sociology, religion, plays a very big part, culture, human biology, anatomy, economy, aesthetics, arts, and you name it, everything comes in here. And to me, as science oriented, this is the largest collection ever of research material gotten together that I ever put my hands on. It's impressive in itself. And on top of that, it's written in a delicate, elusive as instances, beautiful way. He really has his hand with writing as well. That's maybe one of those things that will make this the book of the century, I think, at least. Hard to believe anything else. And it's a start of a complete revolution, no doubt about that. This is going to be a big movement. It's just amazing. This is going to be a big movement. And it's already on the bestseller list. It came out November last year, just a couple of months later. It's well up there in the bestseller. So it's mighty impressive. But it's massive. And what it does, I would say, to put it into the context with the latest 10 to 20 episodes here, I've been rather obsessing with Rodolphe Gachet, of course. To put it in that context, that could actually help to make it more interesting or more understandable as well. What he does is a deconstruction of the thing you can't name, and it's also opening up the path to a peyron, true knowledge, true limits, true borders, true rules, and so forth. Things that matters. And that is actually one of the things in the title, with the matter with things. It has to do with matter, that things can come back and matter once more. And he is marvelous at his job. He has incredibly good intuitions. Just listen to this. It's just going to be a small piece, and it has to be from one of the appendixes. Page 1349. and it's named Hemisphere Differences and Beauty, and it's a review of neuropsychological evidence. Dalia Zadell states, no current research should suggest that the right hemisphere specializes in aesthetic judgment. That's a quote from Dalia Zadell. Let's have a look. Seeing the wood for the trees will be difficult because both hemispheres are inevitably involved at some point. Sorry. My cuckoo alarm sounding once more. For this reason, and this is important, looking at a brain scan is like trying to interpret a painting of Monet by getting closer to the colored dots. Too much conflicting detail that can be understood only by standing back, and I think that's a very, very important point. You can only understand by standing back. Goes for a Monet painting, and it also goes for an MRI. In teasing out which is more important and what hemisphere is more important, it is the effects of cerebral lesions on the appreciation of beauty that should be particularly revealing. If lesions in one hemisphere have a consistently much greater impact than lesions in the other, that would be highly informative about hemisphere differences. Since appreciation of beauty is one of the least manifest impairments after stroke, doesn't fit neatly into any of the standard neurological categories, and is seldom, if ever, inquired about by clinicians. It is not often reported and still less often recorded in print. However, as it happens, David Fisher and colleagues at Harvard Medical School assembled 4 cases of specifically the loss of appreciation of visual beauty, 3 from a review of the literature and 1 of their own. The first was the case of a man who reported that he could no longer become emotionally or sexually aroused by visual stimuli, and that his visual world had become drab and uninteresting. Once an assistant city planner, he was no longer able to appreciate subtle aesthetics, differences between buildings. He had ceased hiking because he found natural scenery dull all the same. He complained bitterly about his loss of emotional reactions to viewing pretty girls or erotic visual stimuli. He had cancelled his subscriptions to Playboy and had withdrawn from heterosexual contact because he found it difficult to become aroused by visual cues. It was also noted that he approached complex visual-perceptual tasks in a piecemeal, feature-analytic manner that greatly compromised speed and accuracy. Isn't that interesting? The second concerned a woman who especially appreciated aesthetics. She was fond of painting aquarelles and enjoyed taking care of the many flowers that grew in her garden. Following her stroke, she complained of lack of emotive reaction elicited by visual stimuli that formerly aroused a powerful feeling of well-being or contentment. I loved flowers so much before. The charm doesn't enter my mind anymore. Looking at the landscape through the windows, I see the hills, the trees, the colors, but all those things cannot convey their beauty to me. Everything looks ordinary, indefinite. I feel indifferent about it. What I lack is feeling. The third was a middle-aged man who complained that, flowers to me have lost their essence. I fail to see them as part of nature. They have become almost synthetic, artificial. I seem to lack a kind of knowledge. No, it's not really a knowledge, rather a certain clarity to see nature itself. If fail to see the flowers in all its authenticity. Just as with flowers, there's also an emptiness to landscapes. I cannot appreciate them. I cannot grasp the beauty of nature. I lack a kind of lucidity, a lucidity in my vision that would normally allow me to appreciate it. Its colors, the temperature of its colors, so to speak. I cannot think of a right word to explain. It just cannot enjoy the sense of beauty that nature brings. I'll imagine it would be a little bit like not being able to enjoy this water pipe, whatever one could call it in English. And at last, their own case. A man who, following a stroke, noted a sense of visual estrangement, his feelings being cut off from what he saw, and whose surroundings did not feel real, which he attributed to a sense of emotional disconnectedness from his visual perceptions. Note ordinary, all the same, failing to arouse, emotive reaction, artificial, lacking authenticity, all of this together with a piecemeal feature analytic manner suggest right hemisphere disruption. So what did the authors find? The principal finding was that all four lesions specifically overlapped with the expected trajectory of the right inferior longitudinal fasciculus. This is an important white matter tract connecting the temporal and occipital cortex and involved in the internal coherence of right hemisphere function. So a very significant finding. Meanwhile, Massimo Marianetti had found decreased perfusion of the right but not left medial temporal lobe caused by drug toxicity in a subject with visual hypoemotionality, similar to that described in these cases. Hypoemotionality is below normal level of emotion or emotional arousal. It is notable that the condition is frequently associated with prosopagnosia and other right lateral signs such as déjà vu, as indeed was in some of these cases. By contrast, a man with a glioma of the left temporal lobe and a consequent right-sided visual field defect, thus indisputable, involving limitations of the left hemisphere's perceptual system, saw flowers as extraordinarily beautiful. Orders intensified, his vision remarkably keen. It is notable that Minkowski describes a schizophrenic subject who is reminiscent of Sachs' Dr. P. He had lost gestalt perception. Of him, Minkowski reports that his mind decomposed every object that it met. The clock was not just a clock, but an assemblage of instruments of torture. Cogs, key, hands, pendulum, etc. Every object that he saw was like the clock. The essential values of an object or another being, such as an aesthetic value, could not be appreciated by him. He was unable to adopt the appropriate attitude. You see these roses, he asked me. My wife would say they are beautiful, but as far as I can see, They are just a bunch of leaves and petals, stems and thorns. And let us here in this instance turn to music. I need to open the door a bit here, it's way too warm. Let's turn to music. Loss of the ability to appreciate music is called amusia. I didn't know that. I have reviewed the lateralization evidence in The Master and His Emissary. Most cases of acquired amusia is when language is bad, in which language is bad is due to right hemisphere lesions, and cases are more severe when there is a right hemisphere involvement. In congenital amusia, structural MRI studies point to an extended network involving temporal and frontal lobes, principally of the right hemisphere. And a functional MRI study of individuals with congenital amusia revealed reduced activity in the right inferior frontal gyrus, 2 small pitch changes. However, one needs to distinguish musical perception and recognition from the aesthetic sense, the ability to see and feel its beauty. Some patients with classical amusia have impaired recognition of music despite a preserved affective response to it. Others, by contrast, who exhibit musical anhedonia, have technical understanding and can recognize, perceive and play music normally. They just cannot appreciate that. There are 7 cases reported in the literature. See how thoroughly McAllister is? When he says there are 7 cases reported in the literature, I would actually presume that that is all there is. We're talking millions of pages, millions of pages. A conductor who sustained a right putaminal hemorrhage found himself unable to have any emotional experience while listening to music. He could not elicit interest from any type of music, even his favorite genre. Before the illness he felt great joy and chills when the harmony sounded complete. He felt that the sound was dull and lacked freshness, though he could acoustically recognize that the harmony was correct in its physical sound properties. This is interesting. It is very similar to the perception we're speaking about of a text that's taken apart, the dissected text, the one deconstruction heals, the one that becomes deconstructed because of reader and writer in consort, and the healing of it, and the regaining of the text aesthetics, which is lost due to polarities and nullification of the text. This is the very same. This is showing from a neurological, a human perspective, what we feel when the text is taken apart automatically by the Gestalt dogma. This is giving flesh to the bones, so deconstruction is once more mirrored, and now in the very biology and experience of people. And I think this is great because this is something one can feel oneself. When I really was involved in linguistics and in the logic and the polarities really constantly were present, I did not listen to music at all. It didn't make any sense to me. It was more or less a waste of time. And my appreciation of art, it was also gone. Why should I spend any time looking at something that could be reduced to being a category or something in disjunct to something else? That was gone. And we see also when we come to the universities, one interesting thing. When you come to those that lack knowledge, they are square, they lack aesthetics, they lack the depth in the surfaces. This is directly affecting the people being in the building or around the building. They lack intellectualization power. Whereas if you turn to Oxford, which is the where the research is coming from, it's just the opposite. This is enhancing the intellectualization. And I remember a remark many years ago. It was someone from, I was actually Stockholm, was commenting, why have you spent so much money and work on these buildings and aesthetics? And I didn't know how, but it sounded so uneducated. It sounded so coarse and like being from a bar or something, saying such a thing. But a professor from Oxford responded directly. It's part of being intellectual. It's part of having depth. It's part of having ability to do abstractions. Because none of these things are possible without the sense of aesthetics. It's something a bit more than just an automatic piling of dichotomies. Something that almost a computer can do, or something less bright of a person. This is much more complicated. It's fractal, it's advanced, it involves both subject and object at the same level and also at this very same time. This is depth of thinking. Let's have one or two more examples here. A 25-year-old amateur guitarist experienced a right temporoparietal hemorrhage from an arteriovenous malformation and found that aesthetic pleasure from the musical world had completely vanished. On hearing pieces played on the piano, he said, "My perception is changed. It's flat, it's no longer three-dimensional, it's only on two planes. There's no emotion. His difficulties increased as the presented composition became more complex. This is even worse. I can distinguish the different instruments, but I can't perceive the whole. In jazz pieces, the relationship between the accompaniment and the solist escaped me." It's pretty gruesome. Horrible. Another example, an elderly retired teacher who from his youth had been an enthusiastic lover of classical music, found after a right temporoparital lobe stroke that he could not elicit interest in any music, even his favorite music or artists. He described the music as dull, lacking freshness. He thought that his symptoms might be caused by listening to recorded music by stereo and would disappear if he listened to music at the live concert. At the concerts of his favorite singer, he felt that, as was expected, the quality of sound was much superior to the recorded one, but he could not experience any emotional response. This is just so extraordinary to hear this. This is scientific proof that our Gestalt dogma eradicates everything that is close to aesthetics, intellectuality, depth, understanding, knowledge, progression. It feels like the this Mr. Brown in the Dead Poets Society got water under his wheel, because now it's even more sure that what he said, taking apart a poem, dissecting it, or literature, or whatever, you either do on purpose or do by reading because you are conjuring the Gestalt dogma, is absolutely true. This is nothing short of amazing. A piano teacher, 10 years after a stroke affecting the right frontoparietal and temporal region, complained that he no longer appreciated music as he used to in the past, and spontaneously reports that he seemed to have lost the capacity to conceive the whole. And finally, there is the case of the middle-aged radio announcer, which is interesting because his loss followed a left-sided infarct involving the insula extended into the frontal lobe and the amygdala. However, in his case, it was only and quite specifically an emotional response to Rachmaninoff preludes that was lost. Otherwise, his sense of musical enjoyment was preserved. So not really a loss of the aesthetic sense. Indeed, some might say that the left hemisphere stroke improved his musical taste. All this is very interesting. Now we get a neurological perspective of logocentrism, how it really affects us. And once we start to understand how it really affects us, this is when it starts to matter. Then it starts to have a point. And then it also has a meaning for the greater majority. It's no longer deconstruction only for an abstract, very, very limited purpose, with possibly a very, very slow and diluted trajectory. This is quite different. Now all sorts of strands, all different levels of fractality come together to make something stronger. And now, of course, it's so much easier to make a decisive point in media, in argument, in talking over the telephone, and even if when you perceive it, which is very important, because you become more whole if you can preserve your own views. And I think that's about enough. It's getting rather hot in here. I say thank you very much, and I wish you a very pleasant afternoon, I could say. Cheers.